Hi there, and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I answer some of the what the fuck questions about relationships with voices in the hearing voices phenomenon. So I'm going to talk about three different ideas in this video. The first is the sort of how we form what and who answers to the questions we ask about voices, the things that shape the characters of voices. And typically, you know, it's the number of entities. Most people who hear voices hear more than one, and each of them is different with different personality. They exhibit sort of body language. That's the personality piece. Each behaves in kind of particular ways. Of course, that you start to learn and you start to kind of anticipate, if you like, in terms of how that particular voice is going to behave. The other is, as you've seen in some of my other videos, there are specific things in the interaction with voices that locate the voices in a particular place. So I went through neighbors, some kind of agency or the CIA, and then sort of spirit voices. There were specific characteristics in the stimuli that located voices. What I haven't talked about much yet is kind of staging. So within that location, how are voices positioned relative to each other? Because that just kind of is also just an indication of how they behave differently, and of course where they're coming from in the detail of interaction. At the other end, you know, so this is about voices, what and who they are. At the other end, the kind of relationship to me and sort of the things that I adjust to, or what I think it actually means for me. So I kind of say, okay, so why is this happening, and why is it happening to me specifically? Because obviously this happens to many more people than just to me. So those are both questions. So why me is a bit of a subset of why this is happening, if you like. And of course, what I want to do, I'm going to do a relationship map here where I actually map out the number of characters and how they're staged, and a little bit about each of their sort of body language, and kind of show you, how it's very real in the experience. And of course, there are some outcomes. So when I act on how voices are treating me, if you like, of course, that becomes part of my story. And those are very real outcomes that I have to account for or defend. So, of course, I start to ask sort of what else. And then there's this thing going on between us. The connection between us has a lot going on in it. It's persistent. It's changing very, very quickly. Each little change changes the scene, changes this kind of scenario. And what I want to do is point out that there are a couple of things that we're not necessarily noticing here. The one is that there is a kind of what I would call a sensory imbalance. So the information that's going between us and how it's derived, so what sense is picking it up, is different in the two directions, and I'll show you that. And of course, by and large, voices have adopted this position of being sort of all-seeing. So actually they see, and therefore we infer know more than actually we do. And then, of course, I'll also show you that voices engineer scenes in which this information that's going back and forth makes sense or doesn't make sense, depending on how you respond to it. So what we're going to focus on is that voices are not just characters that behave in particular ways. We infer from what's going on that they are capable of doing things, that they have a capability. This is stuff they can do, okay? And then, of course, we also make inferences about their intent. And we, of course, it's not just, so we're experiencing their intent. So when they're aggressive, I mean, that's an experience of intent. So we sort of start to ask the question, because most of us experience these things as aggressive and malign. So we ask the question, what are they willing to do in this kind of relationship between why and why me? So we get this picture of voices that is what they are, what they're capable of, and what they're willing to do, which is just a character, a capability, and intent. So you've seen a lot of this before in some of the other videos. So across my sort of 10 or 12 years of experience, I have had different, I've evaluated, if you like, different ideas of what voices are. Actually, which ones I believed didn't make much difference. So sort of across time, of course, I now have the benefit of being able to look at the things across a period of time and kind of say, this is what happened that that put us in this space, which gave voices this characteristic, this character, this capability, and this intent. So that's what I want to kind of do, is sort of focus on here as a sort of recap. So this is how voices populated my worlds with villains, basically new villains that sort of weren't there before. So before I knew of the concept of auditory verbal hallucinations, which was about 8 weeks in the beginning, I heard people talking about what I was doing. Okay, in talking about, they were overheard. I heard a male and a female, so a female and a male in the background. He seems to be okay, she said, and then he said, in the background. So she more interested than he. So this is what I mean by staging. So one in front, more active, one in the background, responding to the one in the foreground. So of course, this is what I mean by staging. So both of them were obviously co-located. They were near each other because they were talking to each other. What located them in my world is this idea that I could overhear them. So they had to be near enough for me to hear them. They were behaving as if they didn't want to be overheard. And obviously they were unseen. I was at home alone. I could hear them, not see them. But of course, they didn't want to be seen either, and they didn't want to be heard. And you get that from the body language. So this is why I'm calling it sort of overheard, one male, one female at first. And what they were responding to, okay, so the information that I was sending unwittingly, obviously they were looking for it, but the information that I was sending unwittingly was my activity in the living room. I happened to be making something to eat. And of course, their next comment was, he eats better than we do. So we're responding to all of those things. We, they're an item, it's male and female. He, they're referring to me as he. So obviously that's in the third person. They're talking to each other. That's one reason. The other reason, of course, is that they didn't know my name. This is my neighbors. We'd seen each other on the staircase, but weren't friends who chatted. So that set up, people overheard, placed the voices in what I'm calling my world, so they had to be nearby. And of course, I then made the inference from that it had to be the neighbors, because they could see what I was doing. That could only be done from the fire escape. The only people with access to the fire escape was the neighbors upstairs. That was a male and female couple, so male-female voice corroborated that. So there were two bits of evidence, if you like, one from voices, one from the fact that, from my actual world, the fact that it was a male and female living upstairs that sort of came together and added coherence to my chain of logic. This is the idea that it was my neighbors made sense of the idea that I would overhear people talking about what I was doing. And then, of course, I rationalized why. So I then kind of, in rationalizing why, what I did was I went backwards in time, looked in my history and kind of said, what happened that might make the neighbors do this? And of course, I picked out the fact that I had hurt myself that afternoon and made a lot of noise. And that was a kind of okay reason for them to be doing what they were doing. And that was all fine on day one. I ran upstairs, knocked on their door to let them know it was okay. There was no reply, but I still left it at that. What didn't make sense was the next day when I still heard them again. So now I'm convinced it's the neighbors because there is no other explanation that's reasonable. There's no other explanation that makes sense. So that's the piece that makes sense, becomes the fixed belief. So if my neighbors have been, were checking up on me last night and now I can hear them the next day, and I'm pretty sure they're not on the fire escape, what's going on? So this is what I say, so the scene has now changed, okay? It's still the same sort of act, my neighbors behaving strangely. They too, when it sort of persists, becomes more unusual. And then there were a bunch of things that happened in that act, if you like, that changed the scene and set off my thinking, looking for new answers to questions I'm actually asking. So the first was that by day 3 or so, a third voice arrived, another female, and then of course then the two females were busy sort of gossiping, if you like, to each other. That's body language again, the gossip. And they were much more actively looking at what I was doing, making more comments during the day. So it filled more of the day, basically, in terms of how voices were behaving. A few days after that, it started to happen in the bedroom and in the bathroom. But that changes the game completely because those, of course, are private spaces. They're not visible from the window. So now, of course, voices can see around corners. They've got this capability now to see around corners. And of course, if they're talking about what I'm doing in the bedroom, that's information, bedroom and bathroom, that's information that you don't normally share with the neighbors. So of course, you ask the question, well, what might they do with that information? So this is then, so I'm getting inferences on this capability and intent that are consistent with somebody nearby able to see into my apartment, even though I now don't know how, because it's not a line of sight thing. So I then start to say, okay, this must be cameras because I can't think of another way. And of course, I start to look for cameras. So the whole experience has been engineered to shift my question to a specific thing that I then look for. And then, of course, later on, voices were talking about my PC screen, of course, about my banking. When I was on a banking site in particular, again, that's not information you want shared. And of course, I then realized that actually I could write them a note on my PC screen, which I did. And of course, voices went quiet that evening, as if obviously responding to me writing the note, at least I thought. And then, of course, the next day I had 6 voices of unknown gender or unclear gender, but of course 6 voices bombarding me. It was just so fast and so sudden and so unexpected, of course. But of course, this is voices now imposing consequences for me writing a note. So this is when intent, in the bigger sense, their intent was obviously malign or not good, not consistent with the rules of behavior of neighbors. But of course, once they responded to a note and imposed consequences, that became a very specific intention. And I'm making the distinction here between intent and intention, because there was a question somebody asked me at a conference, Professor Peter Abbott at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And I thought, actually, it's a very important piece, because I'm describing voices as having intent, because I've seen this litany of behaviors that are malign. Of course, some of them translate to something that's actually experienced. So, of course, the experience here was that just the timing and the increase in the number of voices created the experience that voices had imposed consequences on me for writing them a note which told them to get lost, basically. So it's that we're so very clearly I've experienced voices having the capability to see me, then spy on me, then read my PC screen, and as a result of what I wrote to them. So now originally they were responding to my activity in the flat. Was now they're responding to what I wrote to them on my PC screen. And of course, that's changing how they're behaving completely. So this is the other thing, is that when we say voices are dynamic and whatever, voices are changing their behavior in response to every little thing that I'm doing. Well, literally to everything I'm doing, except that in the beginning, it seemed to be what was visible, I thought, from the window at the kitchen. And then later on, I assumed by cameras, because I had no other way to sort of explain it. And then, as I say, once I wrote them a note, they were responding to my writing them a note, which was directed at them. So that was the first thing I was able to send directly to voices. It was the first response I was able to, specifically kind of send. The other stuff, they might have noticed some slightly unusual things going on in my activity. For example, when I started looking for cameras, that would be unusual if they were watching. They didn't particularly comment on it, but nevertheless, the first thing that I specifically sent to them that I thought was going to them, they responded to by increasing in number and imposing consequences. So to characterize this as kind of hearing voices is a little weird, okay? The thing that makes sense of it is neighbors behaving badly. And of course, I've experienced their presence. They're there, I can hear them, I can't dismiss that. I've experienced their capability, they can see what I'm doing. And suddenly now, since I've written them the note, they've multiplied in number, so they've got more people around. And of course, and from this point on, they were talking to me. So before that, they were talking to each other. Now, since I wrote the note, they're talking to me. And of course, because they're now talking to me, they're behaving completely differently. They're aggressive and they don't care. They're not afraid of being discovered. So playing on this kind of unseen idea, they know that they're unseen. They know that they're out of reach. And that they can impose things on me that I can't impose on them. So when I'm talking about the sensory imbalance, I mean, there's a very good example. They could see me, they could hear me. I could hear them, I couldn't do anything to them. When I wrote them a note, they suddenly multiplied in 6 people, and I'm still, this one person alone at home. Okay, so this is creating this kind of imbalance in the relationship with voices that gives them a sense of power, not specifically over me, but in this case, over my environment, over my home, okay, which is a place that I expect to be comfortable and private, basically. So the big thing that changed, if you like, the thing that shifted the scene dramatically was how voices created this experience of following me, which was experienced as an an increase in their capability. It was experienced as them learning to do something that they couldn't do beforehand. All along, over these first few weeks, I'd only heard them in my apartment, and then at this point, suddenly, they started talking about me going out at my door. So when I was standing inside my apartment door, they started to talk about the fact that I was going out. And then sort of a day later, they started talking, I could hear them just outside my door, still talking about the fact that I was going out. And then a day or two later on the staircase, a day or two later at the bottom of the staircase, on the inside of my door to the street, a day or two after that, just outside the door on my street. And then the odd comment on the street at first. So at this point, I was kind of, because I thought that the problem arose from technology, that cameras were somehow connected to my phone or PC or installed at home, I had taken to working outside of my apartment and was going to an internet cafe or to a coffee shop actually, and doing a lot of work on my PC, trying to discover what was wrong. So of course I was spending more time out of the apartment. So voices, as I say, created this, what I experienced as voices learning to follow me, which then of course changed the game completely. Of course, and then there were a couple of things specifically. I went at one point to an internet cafe to go and log in and check my email. And of course, when I was doing that, because voices are now talking to me, they said, "That's silly. You know that we can see what you're doing. We know that you're logging in. We can trace you electronically from where you're logging in." Of course, that's them just talking up their capability and, of course, their intent at the same time. So of course, I can't ignore those things. I mean, I'm hearing them. It's in my mind. It's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. Of course, it's impossible to ignore. I have that information. I can't just dismiss it. So everything I think about is automatically sucking that information into my process, my cognitive process of actually thinking about it. I can't ignore it. And then, of course, this escalated when I had I'd already given notice on my apartment. I was moving out. The last weekend that I had the apartment, sort of Friday before that, I'd had my PC repaired. I didn't want to take it back to the apartment. On my way back from collecting it, I took it to a hotel nearby, checked in, left the PC in the room, went back to my apartment to get toothbrush, those kinds of things, went back to the hotel. And of course, it was when I was back in the hotel, barely walking in the door, that voices bombarded me. So of course, the only thing I can think of is now, of course, that voices have anticipated me. They know I'm in the hotel room, and of course, they've come to badger me there. And so, of course, this is anticipating what I'm doing, and then, of course, organizing a team to be in the hotel room when I'm there. Of course, this is obviously an indication of capability and intent. Of course, I have no idea what's going on, but I'm experiencing it. My brain is registering all these stimuli, can't ignore it. It's part of my information that whatever I do forever after, I still remember it. As you can tell, this is 12 years later, I remember it that clearly, okay? So it's part of what was going on. Of course, this hotel room, again, this is intent. So again, actually, Porter Abbott said to me, were voices gaslighting you? So I think actually, that's probably a pretty good description of it. It's definitely was designed to make me think I was mad. And of course, what's also happened is voices have now populated the world on the street with villains. So people in the hotel room commenting on what I was doing and telling me what to do, being commanding. There was all this thing about my Ethernet cable that was going on, that much I remember. So of course, what I did was I panicked. I pulled memory cards out of my PC and went to a friend with memory cards in my hand. I was in such a state I didn't know what was going on, as I say. But of course, the world on the street is now populated with villains. And of course, I have to come up with some sort of description of who this is. And of course, I don't know who it is specifically, but what I do know is that it must be an agency of some sort, because it's a team of people, of 6 or 7 voices coming and going as they please, basically, on the street. So it has to be some sort of agency acting in secret or acting clandestinely. It's the only, so this is where we get these beliefs about conspiracy and the CIA or the Russian army or something doing these things. So of course, this panic in the hotel room is what led me to go to the doctor. The doctor described it as auditory hallucinations. So this AVH is auditory verbal hallucinations. That's the typical description. I'm just showing this yellow line here because, of course, this is now very much a shift in the frame of reference that I'm using. So what I'm doing now is, instead of experiencing this minute by minute, I'm looking at all of this and saying, okay, if the doctor's describing this as auditory hallucinations, does that description make sense of this? So I didn't have the clarity then that I do now on what was kind of going on, but I knew I had been deceived. I knew that voices had mimicked my neighbors and that I'd been deceived. I mean, I knew that there was no other way for me to interpret that. I didn't really know what was going on here. I mean, this made no sense to me. Okay, but of course, I tried this idea, or is it auditory verbal hallucinations, and I couldn't get it to make sense. Okay, so my interpretation of this was that obviously this is my mind misbehaving in some way. So it's some sort of dysfunction in the brain, which is either something that's gone wrong with an actual function in the brain, or, as I later came to discover, I didn't have this idea at the time, was that this might be produced by some kind of psychological theme. So there's a fairly large group within people who hear voices that have had past trauma. And of course, one of the theories is that past trauma might cause this. But of course, this made no sense to me at all because I'd had no past trauma. I'd had a great life up to that point. There was absolutely nothing going on in my life or in my past or in my family that made sense that I would suddenly kind of start hearing voices. But of course, I started to say, okay, this must be my brain misfiring. So now my explanation of how this is happening, that I'm trying to explain how voices, I could overhear these things, two over there talking to each other, and then following me, 6 or 7 of them talking to me, of course, as my brain misfiring. So I thought if my brain is going to misfire, it's going to do something either randomly or a pattern that repeats. And of course, the other thing that made no sense was while voices were talking to me, they were now talking about being people who had died. They were originally Stephen and Maureen, which were the names of people I knew that I thought had passed on. Stephen definitely had. Maureen I didn't know, but I thought she was because of the age she would be at that point. They didn't behave like Stephen and Maureen, so I rejected them. And they then simply said they are people who had died. But of course, what they were doing was tying into a general belief in some kind of here and after. But actually, what they were doing was they were setting the scene in an other world. Okay, that's really what was going on. But so whilst this was happening, this sort of conversational thing with voices about who they were, I'm trying to make sense of this idea that the medical term auditory verbal hallucinations would explain all of this. And so, of course, this, in addition to these voices, my brain is working normally. I'm responding to everyday stimuli around me in the normal way. Sometimes voices are talking about what I'm seeing, and of course, they're trying to change my perception of it. And over here, of course, they had deceived me. I mean, but these were still voices that I had responded to in the way you would expect my brain and my mind to respond to them. Okay. So what I'm saying, this stuff is happening in parallel to my brain operating kind of normally. Of course, the medical descriptions are that it's a chemical imbalance, which has since been thoroughly discredited and is obviously just nonsense. The fact that it's still our first line course of treatment is absurd. The idea that it might be a kind of psych issue, as I say, sort of stem largely from the hearing voices movement, people saying, well, something happened to me. That only works, if something has happened to you and you match the bullying pattern to what happened to you beforehand. Of course, and one of the psychiatric diagnoses is the idea of some sort of personality disorder where voices are parts of your lost personality that you need to integrate. I can't think of anything more absurd and more dumb, frankly, than that. So, of course, this explanation from the clinical professionals, if you like, made no sense for me at all. But of course, what happens is, of course, voices continued. And as I mentioned, of course, they're now talking to me and they're engaging with my thoughts. So they say that started to happen over here right at the end in the kind of hotel room, but in the flurry, I didn't really notice. Over here, I kind of realized, okay, voices are now engaging with my thoughts. And at first I thought that's a good idea because now I have something to fight back with. Now I felt like we were on equal terms. They're talking to me and I can talk to them, even though it's in my head. I mean, the conversation is happening. My thoughts are being shared, whether I like it or not. So voices are responding to my thinking. So this is why I'm calling this kind of telepathic. So then the inference, of course, that I'm making from the fact that this communication is telepathic is that these things who are sort of claiming to be from a spirit world might make sense. Of course, that was the whole point, was voices were trying to convince me that the idea that they were people who had died is what made sense of telepathic communication. It's just the response with me because I wasn't inclined to believe this at first. Of course, it could easily have been the other way around. I could easily have said, okay, if something is communicating with me telepathically, then, as I put in here in brackets, it must be from a spirit world. I didn't buy that in the beginning. But nevertheless, I suddenly had far more voices didn't take very long for voices to get pretty aggressive and bombard me, of course, because I was rejecting these kinds of ideas. And of course, because when I realized, okay, I can fight back, of course, I started to get aggressive and just keep telling them to fuck off, basically, because it was just a pain in the ass, just irritating. I mean, it was just this bombardment all day that was just a real, became a real distraction. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't do anything. But anyway, voices claimed that there were 150 million in my voices, or just voices in my head. It was just an attempt to scare me. I mean, I could only hear really one at a time, even though I might have 10 at a time. They'd all be one after the other, basically, all jumping on something different. And of course, the other big thing about them was, of course, they're coming and going at will. I have no control of when they're there, when they're not there, and of course, what they're sort of engaging with. And of course, they now are actually sort of intervening or claiming to intervene. And of course, because they're claiming to intervene, and I have no idea what's going on, I'm trying to disprove it. And of course, disproving it is becoming a bit more difficult. But of course, from a capability point of view, this is in my mind. I'm experiencing all these things. From an intent point of view, they're making all these claims about what is going on in the world around me and how they can actually influence it. And of course, their intent is explicitly to intervene and change not just my world, but the world. And of course, what they're responding to is now everything that I'm doing, but most importantly, to my thoughts. And of course, this is the most frightening thing when you realize that actually this thing is behaving incredibly badly towards you, and all your thoughts are shared, whether or not you like it. And of course, in amongst those thoughts, there are some that they are picking out and placing more emphasis on. So there are some ideas that they respond to more than others. So at first they were kind of selective, if you like. Then they became just full-time presence for about a year and a bit, 15 months or something like that. I don't know how I survived those 15 months, but responding literally to every thought. It was absolutely kind of awful. But of course, what this did was it placed voices in this other world. And of course, in an other world, these entities are capable of who knows what. And of course, the only thing I have to from which to estimate their intent or predict their intent is their behavior. So of course, I'm experiencing them as telepathic. They're behaving cruelly. And of course, they're claiming to have intervened in the world around me. So I've got to disprove that. I mean, there is no way for me to prove it. I have to disprove it because, of course, they're doing it selectively. Of course, it's not that it's happening. At some point, they did claim that they were making everything around me happen, but that pretty soon becomes ridiculous. But later on, with these strange things going on, and you know you're being deceived, there are easily things that happen that you can't describe. And of course, what you then do is you then attribute them to voices that are actually claiming they made them happen anyway. So of course, that then changes your whole view of the world. And of course, what's happened here is voices have exaggerated this position of being away from you. Over here, they were just unseen. Over here, they were actually in hiding, acting clandestinely, secret, incapable, or they wanted me to believe they were incapable of being discovered, so they could actually just be cavalier about imposing consequences and doing what they wanted to do. Neighbors at least there's at least the plausible idea that you might discover them if you find the camera. This lot, when they're sort of following you, if it's the CIA or whatever, the chances of me discovering them and proving that it's them are zero, of course. So what they've done is they've escalated themselves into this position where they're out of reach and all powerful, if you like, in the world around me, certainly powerful enough to influence events, and certainly powerful enough to be in the hotel room next door when I've checked in, of course, and that's all about making you feel unsafe in the world. Over here, they're claiming this all-seeing advantage point because they can certainly see stuff from a sort of bigger picture that I don't always see. And of course, they're obviously unseen because they're not spirit beings. They have no physical embodiment. So it's not just that they're unseen, it's that they're invisible, okay? And of course, being invisible gives them the power to act in surprising ways that we don't know is happening, of course. And of course, because they've already deceived me, I don't know who else they're deceiving. Because they can respond to my thoughts, they seem to know what some other people are thinking. Of course, you then sort of give them this idea of being sort of all-knowing. And of course, they then just over time escalated their power. They went, as I say, from minions to God, to being the devil, and then to being an evil God. So of course, these things made sense in different, or made sense of history of the history of my interaction with voices in kind of different ways. None of them made sense individually, but the idea that that this voice was claiming to be God, then writing the Bible, didn't like my ideas, so of course set the devil on me. Of course, as I was rejecting this, the idea then that actually God is just an evil God was intended to make sense of all of this, but certainly created the experience of that by making all these dots connect. So all this information was in my brain, and of course, in the same way that It's the Neighbors made sense of this, the idea that God was an evil God, if you like, made sense of this, except that I don't believe that, that there is a God, let alone an evil God, but there's certainly something that is behaving pretty evilly. And of course, that makes sense of all of this. The idea that they have the power of a God is ridiculous, okay? But nevertheless, there is something that's behaving that way. So really, what's really happening is it's this line over here that's locating voices. And once you've located a voice, you're assigning capability and intent that is coherent in that context, okay? So consistent with that context. So over here, it had to be people. Over here, it was some sort of agency. Over here, my brain, just made no sense though of it. Over here, some sort of telepathic entity, what of course I couldn't prove one way or the other, was the actual capability in the world around me, other than to say, of course, a voice claiming to be God has actually intervened in the world and implemented several belief systems in conflict with each other that has been the cause of wars for millennia, for example, which of course is something that voices kind of use in this argument. So really what I'm saying here is that the world that voices are located in represents where voices are. It represents their frame of reference. So it's this thing, it's out of reach. There's this intent that I don't really know because they're not sharing it with me, but I'm inferring from my experience of voices. There's a capability which I'm saying is a possible capability that I'm experiencing in the interaction. So from the interaction, I'm inferring what their possible capability is. I don't know for sure what it is, but based on what I'm experiencing and where it's located, I'm estimating what the capability might be. And of course, what's happening here is that the rules have changed completely. So the rules of interacting with neighbors have now just been completely ignored by the neighbors, which is why I can't approach them to kind of challenge them on this thing without any evidence. The idea that some sort of clandestine agency would place surveillance on me in the street and talk to me and make me part of the problem, of course, made no sense at all. So this is not how you expect those agencies to operate at all. And of course, in this world, who knows what the rules are? Voices were making them up as they go on. Of course, the other thing that was happening is in this relationship with voices, the information that voices were sharing with me was that over here, they were mimicking two people, a male and a female, talking about what I was doing at a distance. So the whole thing, overheard, at a distance, not wanting to be heard, not wanting to be seen, all of that stuff in the body language was voices mimicking. So this phenomenon is mimicking two people behaving in that way nearby. So the only conclusion that I could reach was it's the neighbors. Over here, voices were, because voices were talking to me, I was kind of starting to ask the question, well, what are you? And of course, there was no response to that. So they were withholding what answers to what they were. Of course, what that led to was me speculating what they might be. So of course, I'm speculating on the basis of this behavior, this following, this anticipating me, being in the hotel room next door. So whatever answer I reach is going to be something that's powerful and is malign. So it can do lots of stuff, find me in a hotel room, and it's behaving badly. So its intent is malign, even if I don't know what its specific intention is, okay? And then over here, voices were being conversational, so they were kind of probing. So of course, because they were now responding to me, I was asking them questions. And of course, so there was this, I was evaluating everything they said and trying to make sense of it as you would in a sort of conversation with people. Whereas over here, what voices were doing is they were making assertions. We are this, I am God, I am the devil, I am we are aliens, we are this, we are that, we are the other. So of course, what I'm doing with that is I'm rationalizing. So when I'm rationalizing, so this has happened, voices have said, I am God. I can't prove nor disprove that as a statement. So what I do is I look at all the experience and say what in the experience would give credibility to that statement, okay? And that, so what voices are doing, this mimic, withhold, probe, and assert, is actually pushing my cognitive response in a particular way. So over here, I'm interpreting based on what I have. Over here, I'm speculating based on what little I have, okay? Here, I think I have pretty much all the info. here I know I only have a little, so I'm speculating. Over here, I know that I don't have all the info and I don't know what I'm dealing with, so we're going back and forth. Okay, over here, voices are asserting, I know I don't have all the info, so I'm actually looking for little bits that fit. And of course, it's very easy to find stuff in the experience that fits the idea that voices are evil. After all, they deceived me, they created this experience of being followed, all of which I now know was nonsense. Not that they stopped them from using the idea that as God, the way they would get to me was through a conspiracy, and they could place people in the world around me in the street and next door to me at home or even in my apartment. Of course, there were all those sort of claims about that this is what would happen. So the most important thing is this line that locates voices, because this kind of makes all our ideas about what voices are, what they're capable of, and what their intent is actually coherent in the experience. And that's the piece that we're actually missing. So to characterize this as auditory hallucinations clearly doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? Right, so then next. So how am I making sense of this? What I want to do is kind of point out this, sort of just put the focus on this kind of question in the middle, this interaction between voices and I. So, and I'm doing this kind of against now looking at our cognitive process. So typically I'm saying that actually a stimulus arrives in a setting, which is what creates our expectations. And based on that stimulus in that setting, we react to it. That's our initial emotional kind of response to it, and that points our response in a particular way. So we then kind of say, okay, I'm thinking about this. This is what I think the situation or circumstance is. And then from that, I'm going to select some actions to act on, and it becomes an outcome in the world. So from a stimulus, I have an emotional reaction to it, which points my thinking in a particular way, the question I'm answering. And then I kind of try and balance all the questions, which are these. And I kind of say, okay, this is the outcome in my head. Based on that, I could do this or this or this. And of course, I'll pick one and act on it, and that's the outcome in the world. Now, the questions that this process provokes are more or less mapped to this process. I mean, of course, we can obviously shift them around, but I mean, there is a natural flow. So, so when, okay, so stimulus, the when of a stimulus is the new thing that arrives in a context, which is usually derived from where I am. It tells me something about the origin of the stimulus, the what and the who, that's arriving. And then if I don't know what it is, I'm going to ask the question, well, how is this happening? Of course, later on, when I've accepted the idea that it's telepathic, I know how it's happening. And of course, I'm asking the question, why, and sort of why me? So, well, why are you doing this now, okay? And why me? And what I want to do is kind of show you how the game changes completely from here to here to here. So over here, I was, the location was in my world. That kind of sets the bigger picture expectations. Things have to be coherent with the idea of my world sort of nearby. It was happening while I was in the living room, and that was, distressing to one degree. And in the bedroom and bathroom, it became more distressing. So I'm just using my colors there to indicate an escalation of distress. I'm talking about them as I'm saying my neighbors are, they're doing this. So of course that already is an indication that I'm reading this as sort of capability. When it moved along kind of in the world, it was happening when I was out and about on the streets, in an internet cafe where they were kind of mocking me, in a hotel room where I was beleaguered, I was attacked. Okay, even though it was from the room next door, it was all these threatening kinds of things. And of course, what I'm saying about them here is they can. So of course, so this is my indication, of, as I say, the sort of growth in my experience of the capability and intent of voices. So if they're already doing this, behaving badly, that says something about their intent, and they can do this, that says a lot about their capability. And all that stuff has happened automatically in my sort of processing, trying to answer these questions as each stimulus arrives. So every little one is reinforcing this kind of idea that voices are behaving badly and they can do these things. So this is why it's so difficult for a clinician to convince somebody that it's not the neighbors doing this. Why would the neighbors do that? Well, actually, the neighbors behaving badly. That's why they're doing it. And of course, that's the experience of it. What makes sense of it is neighbors behaving badly. And of course, when I say make sense of it, it literally makes it coherent in my brain. The information objects that are answers to these questions actually fit together logically. And of course, to come along and say that that's not real, okay, doesn't quite cut the job. It's not real that the neighbors are spying on me, but it is real that my brain has experienced those stimuli that mimic the neighbors spying on me. Okay, so my brain is experiencing it whether I like it or not. So of course, what this does is, the outcome in the mind, my explanation for it is it seems to be because they can. I mean, I can't think of a reason why my neighbors would do this, or the CIA or whoever would follow me on the street. But the experience of it and the way voice is behaving is it's simply because they can, and they don't give a damn. And then, of course, the outcome in the world is, well, there's these things I do, So, I mean, I called my neighbors, a friend of mine over, my landlady over to say, could you hear? I got a gadget from one of my friends who volunteered it to check for cameras in the apartment. I gave notice on my apartment. I had all sorts of work done on my PC. I checked into this hotel my last weekend in the apartment to keep my PC away from the apartment. Everybody else is seeing that stuff as unreasonable, but actually, from within the experience, they were all very reasonable things to do. So I'm saying it's the neighbors behaving badly, and by you I mean people around me are saying Greg's gone mad, basically, whatever language they're using, and they will probably add well, it must be, it's perhaps because of, something like that. And over here, of course, I wasn't claiming conspiracy at that stage, but I'm certainly seeing the capability of conspiracy. I just hadn't gone as far as the intent, because lots of people who hear voices do. Because what's happening here that we're not noticing is incoming, I can hear, and very specifically not see. Voices have kept, the neighbors have been on the fire escape where I couldn't see them, okay? They didn't think I could hear them, I happened to overhear them, okay? So what that tells you a lot about what's going in and out. So incoming for me was I could hear, but I could not see. But they could see, and they of course had heard me earlier in the afternoon. So they've got two senses, I'm working with one. And this is the sensory imbalance that I'm talking about that we don't even realize is happening. And then on top of that, in sort of Act 2, after I'd written them the note, they started talking to me. They could talk to me, and obviously they were reacting to my actions, and they could obviously hear what I was saying. They imposed these consequences by increasing in number directly after I'd written them a note. But of course, all I could do was shout and write them a note. I couldn't do anything, whereas they're following me and anticipating me and upping the game in an internet cafe, mocking me, upping the game in a hotel with a whole bunch of voices badgering me saying, do this, don't do that. So there's this very strong imbalance in capability that ties to a very basic imbalance in sensory capability in these two directions. Over here, the thing to mention here, of course, as you'll have gathered, is that these are all experiences I'm talking about, but actually the only things, you could see this afterwards with the great benefit of hindsight, the only things that voices changed were where I heard them, so living room, bedroom, bathroom, down the staircase, on the street, in the internet cafe, in the hotel. That was just voices choosing where to badger me. Of course, where is timed to when. And then, of course, what they responded to. So initially, it was my actions, then literally my physical actions, as if they could see them. Then me writing a note reacting to a note on a PC screen, which I suppose, which wasn't a line of sight thing. It was literally on the screen. It was the only way they would see it. And then, of course, me checking into the hotel room. So, of course, so it's just they're upping the ante in response to something that I've done or am doing, basically. And of course, that gives you this reading of both capability and intent in ways that you wouldn't, that are obviously exaggerated. There's no doubt in my mind that voices could hear me all of this time, and they could talk to me at any point in time, and they could engage with my thoughts at any point in time. They just chose not to. They chose to do this stuff piecemeal to create these experiences. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. So of course, the where when over here, when this thing moved into the other world, is it actually became something that would happen anytime. So where became less relevant. And not only that, all the time, because by this time I had voices bothering me all day. And then of course, they're extending that even more and claiming that this could go on for eternity. And that even if I died, they could just send me back again and do it all over again, basically, is this kind of idea. Or that they would badger me forever after, in a hereafter, unless I did, what they did, which was, not very exciting. Certainly goes against all my values. But not only that, a lot of it was just impossible anyway. And of course, the frame of reference that voices are operating from is that there is a war between good and evil. So this was their statement. There is a war between good and evil. This is their argument for why they were bugging me. and that it was my job as the second coming. They declared, you are the second coming, whether you like it or not. I, God, have chosen you to be my second coming. So this is the frame of reference they're operating from. And this is the piece that voices are making sense of this whole experience from this frame of reference. So this is a very, very, very important piece that to me actually proves that voices are external. My brain is a process that's answering all of these questions. I mean, I can typically only hold 3, 4, 5 things, ideas in my brain, in my mind at sort of one time. So my brain is going, you know, if this is where I am and this is the stimulus I'm receiving, then I'm picking an answer for what and or who this is. You know, because it's unusual, I'm asking the question, how is it happening? And then I'm inferring, well, why and kind of why me? Voices are operating from this completely different frame of reference that I reject. I utterly and completely reject this idea. So I don't accept it at all. So it's not locked in my brain as true, whereas voices are saying, this is true, okay? And if this is true, then we can do all these things to you, okay? And in that context, all these things to you, which I'll show you on the next slide, make sense. So what's happening here now, of course, is voices are coming from the other way around. They're saying we're in another world, anywhere, anytime. There is a war between good and evil. You are the second coming, like it or not. And in that context, we're communicating with you telepathically, a two-way thing. We're bothering you in whichever one way or another that we can. The incoming is a sort of bunch of multimodal stimuli, plus a whole bunch of things that are tempo, clarity, distance, direction, all choreographed in 4D. And by 4D, I mean literally 3D plus time, okay, to create the scene. So in exactly the same way as the neighbor spying on me was a scene that voices created, something or other following me on the street was a scene that voices created. Voices have created a whole bunch of other scenes that now connect this other world to this world in a way that is designed to lead me to exaggerate their capability and their intent, okay, in exactly the same way. So from this frame of reference, voices are engaging with me telepathically, two-way. So they've made it two-way. So my thoughts are what they are, my thoughts and actions, in fact, everything are what they're reacting to. But more than that, they're provoking. They're throwing stuff at me, seeing how I react. And of course, my thoughts are my reaction and my response. And that's what they're engaging with. So I don't have time to stop and think about it and say, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. Voices are engaging with the thoughts that they provoke. It's as absurd as that. And of course, the interaction is now with something at the level of thought, and those interactions are registering in exactly the same way as an interaction with an actual entity standing right in front of you. And of course, so in this mode, this two-way telepathic provocation, voices are able to turn it on and off. They sort of come and go, and they change the volume. They come and go when they want to. That's the sort of staging thing. So I typically have a little bit of tinnitus, and then they come in and out of that tinnitus. And then, of course, there are multiple levels. So I have these 3 voices that claim to have front row seats. I have voices in the background saying, I love you. There's all this staging going on that gives credibility to the story, if you like, of this drama, cosmic opera in this other world. And, of course, I'm in the middle of trying to kind of sort it out. So incoming is all this complex stuff that actually our 5 senses aren't quite enough to describe it. And outgoing, what I'm sending, like it or not, is every thought and every action. And of course, voices sometimes make my thoughts audible. And making it audible is actually just a way to bring more attention to my thoughts. So voices did this for a long time, created this sort of thought echo, did it in the same way as they created this experience of following. They did it as this kind of idea that they were learning to tune into my thoughts step by step, one learning from another, all this staging to create this huge, to bring this emphasis to my thoughts, so that I became acutely aware of my thoughts. And of course, thoughts are one thing you can do nothing about. If voices provoke, you think, period. Your brain is on all the time. You're thinking all the time that you're not sleeping, basically. And of course, voices are provoking and peppering you with stuff. And of course, that's what they're engaging with. So there's this very powerful imbalance here. The only thing that I have to fight back with is my thoughts. And of course, it's my thoughts that voices are engaging with. And of course, they're engaging with those thoughts before they're fully formed. So that's this huge power imbalance in this kind of thing that we're not actually realizing. So, and of course, from that, of course, because voices know my thoughts, they then claim that they know the thoughts of others. And you only need a few things where that seems to be real, and of course, you believe it. I mean, so obviously you can tell from this, I reject everything about voices. And obviously I've analyzed it to death, but I have a few incidents where voices clearly knew what somebody else was thinking and have told me what that is. And of course, then that person has said something along, along those lines, or sometimes pretty much exactly. And of course, my only response to that is, so what? They may know what other people are thinking in the same way that they know what I'm thinking, but it doesn't mean they know what somebody else will think in the future, which of course is what they claim. And of course, they escalate that sort of knowing to omniscience and to omnipotence. And of course, that's the piece that voices are doing. It's exaggerating their power, which is, to me, not real. But of course, the terms now of this relationship with voices are that they know everything. And of course, they parlay that, as I say, into omnipotence and omniscience. So what's going on here now, I'm going to do the relationship map, is just kind of say, well, okay, what's the sort of complexity of this thing, all these things. So voices are operating from this kind of frame of reference. They're saying there is a war between good and evil, and there's nothing I can do about it. It exists. It's been going on for millennia. You are the second coming, like it or not. And of course, that sounds good. It isn't. It sort of makes you part of, it makes you their sort of go-to boy, if you like. It makes you their scapegoat. It makes you all sorts of things. It ties you to their history. Everything I reject about it, of course, but they're saying you are the second coming because you're a nice guy, cute, smart, affable, all these kinds of things. And of course, the evidence that I have, and of course they joyfully agree with, is that the revealed religions are in fact proof that voices have in fact intervened in the world in the past. Okay, so that's undeniable. And of course, they're simply saying, we're doing this again, and you're the guy in the middle as the second coming. Okay, so it's pretty hard to discount that piece. Of course, so what I have to discount is to say, well, actually, you're not God, and your intervention is through beliefs. You didn't actually intervene. You persuaded people to act on your behalf in a climate where people already believed in gods. Of course, nowadays, people, well, a lot of people do, I don't. And of course, I'm rejecting you. I'm not buying into what you're saying, God. Okay, so the situation is very different. We acted on what voices, well, yes, people acted on what voices said 2,000 years ago. We're not doing it anymore. On top of that, they've created this sort of cast of I love yous and I tell yous. So this is this sort of two teams, if you like, some that are on my side, some that are not. And of course, I have these three voices that came along and claimed to have front row seats that are sort of putting very much the spotlight on me. So I'm trying to represent here. Three voices that say claim to be front row seats, and these are the ones who are badgering me all the time. There's this fourth one in the back that sort of comes and goes. That kind of acts like a sort of supervisor. When we reach some sort of deadlock, there's this fourth one that sort of comes in. And this has been a sort of fairly constant sort of theme for, I don't know, 8 of the 12 years or something that I've heard voices, maybe more, 10 of the 12 years, something like that. I don't remember the dates exactly. But of course, there is this group of voices that I started to call the I love yous. I'm again not sure exactly when this happened, but sort of year 2 or something. I started hearing these voices saying, I love you. And it was voices definitely in the background, coming more forward sometimes, sort of in sort of applause, sort of showing approval, if you like, but that was the experience of it. But really, they were only saying, I love you or we love you. And of course, I went through a million different rationalizations of why that would happen. And it all relates to the idea of being chosen, as the second coming, or as a man who might understand. Was another form of language that's kind of used. That to sort this problem out. The same problem is the revealed religions. Voices intervened. One way to sort it out is as the second coming. The other way to sort it out is as not the second coming. Of course, and I do both of those. Is the whole idea. And of course, these voices are approving of the not the second coming piece. And of course, what that does is it sets the stage to say which team actually chose me, the good guys or the bad guys, of course. And it's just part of the game in this kind of relationship that keeps changing the scene. Okay, it's just one of the myriad of little ideas and big ideas that voices can use to kind of change the scene. So the other things that are going on then is that this team has a bunch of other voices that they bring in and out, or that come and go depending on the scene they're trying to engineer. So they have this group of what I call fake I love yous. So these voices are saying I love you. These voices are also saying I love you. They usually say Greggy boy in front. So they're much closer. They're much louder. They're usually, the thing with these sort of voices saying I love you, of course, is that's creating mania. That's kind of stimulating positive reward. And of course, the stuff that's stimulating positive reward is the stuff that you do more of. So of course, it's one of the things that's kept me going through all of this thing. But at the same time, there was a point where I kind of was trying to switch the stuff off and stop thinking about it. And of course, I kept hearing this stuff. And of course, what voices, the bad guys amongst the voices that I'm calling the Italias are just imitating the I love yous to try and annoy me about any role that this team is actually playing, but of course also to distort so that I couldn't actually understand which things those voices are encouraging and which things these voices are encouraging. So it was this complete, just a way to distort my sense of priorities, which was very successful, I might add. Okay, I mean, I obviously devoted a huge chunk of my life to this stuff without any financial reward for it so far. And of course, that was in large part from this kind of distortion of my reward signals. My brain literally just would not let it go. So I stopped working on it and actually did, worked in the kind of traditional sense for a while, of course. And then because it kept bugging me, I stopped working and did this again for full time. I'm now working as an estate agent and doing this part-time because it just keeps bugging my brain and my brain won't let it go. Of course, and then there were these other things that I knew belonged to the bad guys, was this sort of no chorus and what I call a yes chorus. So it's this kind of chorus that comes along and they're saying, yes, we agree, or no, we don't agree. So there's a number of different ways that voices were able to bring in other teams that agreed or disagreed. So it's just a way for them to actually kind of lead you along and think they're agreeing, and then something else comes along to disagree. So in the same way that something higher up in the hierarchy would come along and change the rules. So I had minions who then brought God, and God's the one who asked me to rewrite the Bible, of course, and then he agreed and then disagreed, and then the devil came along and disagreed. Same thing, they had this bunch of voices from other sources and other groups that were able to come in and basically agree or disagree, is essentially what it is. I say with a litany of other roles and locations. They were sort of universe reps, what I started to call galaxy gals, who were sort of good guys roaming the universe, having chosen me and solving this problem on Earth, and that would then solve it on other planets, this kind of stuff. Yes, believe it or not. All these planet reps who came to hear what I had to say and to kind of say, well, would it work where they are? Yes or no, kind of things. 5 different teams that were interviewing me for being the second coming, all with different frames of reference, agreeing to some things and not to other things. So of course, this, these sort of lost souls, because you'd hear these little bits here and there sort of in the distance, and then they come together in sort of groups, and they were saying they were collecting lost souls in groups to save them, even down to dolphins. So I have this thing about dolphins and whales that I just happen to love. And of course, in teasing voices, I would say I'm talking to the whales, talking to the dolphins. And of course, so, because I believe in evolution and talk about diversity of species and things, they were kind of saying, well, they were dolphins or they were dinosaurs that were extinct. They were just trying to bring in any idea that would kind of change the game, basically, and change the rules kind of the game. And of course, remembering what's going on here, and then there were a bunch of other voices, just random things that would pop up anywhere and everywhere, different direction, different scene, different setting, just again, to change the game and kind of sort of bring in something that, that didn't sort of make sense at the time. And then, of course, the thing to remember is the sensory imbalance. There's this kind of what I'm calling forced telepathy, and by forced, I mean, I can hear all this stuff in 4D with voices. Of course, the forced piece is my thoughts are being shared, whether I like it or not. And like I say, then there's all these sort of auditory and spatial sort of conditions that voices are creating that sort of change the scene, the sort of clarity, distance, direction, staging, numbers, all these things that completely change the kind of scene. There's all these sort of more sensory type things. There's the verbal stuff, the body language, the emotions. So voices can say, they call me Greggy Boy, they can say Greggy Boy in a cute way, they can say Greggy Boy in a way that just sounds mind-bogglingly evil. And to the point that literally you react with fear. I mean, it sounds weird, but voices can say Greggy Boy in a way that you would react with fear, but they can. And all these sort of then visions and dreams, they're imposing these visual things on me that I know are coming from voices because they're talking about it. And of course, they're engaging in my dreams. Of course, they claim ownership of the dream. And usually at some point, the dream will wake me up and they'll badger you about the dream. I mean, I've typically forgotten them the next day, but of course, because I just dismiss it. I mean, that's just become my response to them. And then there are all these other somatic kinds of things. So literally physical sensations, anything from pinpricks. So voices spoke about refitting my body, for example, and had pinpricks in my joints, basically. Elbow, shoulders, elbows, knees, hips, and them kind of saying, we're checking this piece, we're checking this piece, we're checking this piece, much like aliens might, play with your fiddly bits. I've had voices play with my fiddly bits as well. This same kind of thing. So anything from pinpricks to orgasms. So some mental health pros don't believe that there are somatic sensations. Voices are using somatic sensations primarily for punctuation and to make threats. Pain, temperature, tempo, all of these things, different ways of engineering scenes and to make a point, keeping you awake. Or some of the worst experiences I've had of voices just sitting there and saying you're not going to go to sleep and then just prodding you every minute or two. But I say it's all this theater and engineered scenes, and all I have is my thoughts. So all the stuff coming one way but going back is just my thoughts, which is the very thing that voices are engaging with, as I say, before they're fully formed. So it's no surprise that it takes a long time before you sort of formulate an idea that becomes fixed in your head, and you kind of say, okay, this is kind of immovable. So I rejected everything about voices, but even so, when they were making these assertions, I was still trying to disprove or disprove, prove or disprove, mostly disprove what they were kind of saying. But of course, in doing that, you're knitting this stuff into your brain, into information in your brain. And of course, what distinguished the sort of character of each of these voices, just going back to the sort of a reading of their personality and, if you like, their intent, was that the sort of loving voices pretty much always said, so there was the verbal and body language and emotion, but pretty much the stuff they said was only we love you or I love you. So you'd get we love you almost as a chorus, and you get the occasional one popping out with its own sort of character saying I love you, Greggy boy. And of course, the other thing they would do was kind of stage this back and forth. So they were mostly in the background, but they would sort of come forward every now and again. And actually, for the last year and a half or so, they've been much more in the foreground than they used to be. And then over here, it became, this was kind of Squealy. This is the voice they claimed to be God. I eventually named him and called him Squealy. So his kind of theme was, he's the sort of sociopath. You are my second coming. I'm going to re-engineer the world. I've intervened beforehand. I'm going to make you my second coming, whether you like it or not. And it isn't going to be good, basically. It's what he's kind of saying. And he's saying, this is reality. I have intervened. And I'm going to make it up as I go. You're a new opportunity. I'm having fun, just messing with you. I don't really care what happens, but we'll see what happens. So I'm going to use you to change the world. Of course, is kind of what they're saying. What he's saying. Tutu. This is again the name I gave voices. Tutu behaves like a psychopath. He's actually saying, literally saying, this is total war, Greggy boy, and then behaving that way, and actually saying that, look, this alternative reality is already a fact. We can make it worse, and I'll show you by making it worse for you. And got really vindictive, vicious, miserable, fucking hateful, so-and-so. And of course, you can't say these things to somebody about these kind of voices because they think you're the problem. But it actually is a natural response to how cruel these freaking things are. Absolutely vile. And then Poopsie, who I call Narcissi Poo, a bit of a narcissist, or a lot of a narcissist, just because she can't actually come up with anything, is just there demanding attention. It can be anything from sit down and turn on the TV, Greggy boy, Greggy boy, we don't care. It's just stuff that irritates. And the more they irritate, of course, the more likely I am to get angry. And of course, when I get angry, they can provoke me to do other things, basically. Or for me, actually, the stuff that spills over mostly is anger. It's irritation and anger. So I will usually find somewhere where I think people can't hear me. I discovered the other day that actually I was in a place where people could hear me. And I will just yell at voices because it's just a way to vent anger. So I'll do it in the car when I'm driving. I'll do it kind of at home if I think nobody else is around. I will just find a space where I can actually sort of yell at voices. And her sort of comment is, in my world, actually, I am something. And of course, she's anything but anything. She's this absolutely useless little fuckwit. It's just a pain in the ass, to put it mildly. And of course, I say it's just this constant irritation. It's provocation. That's really all it is, which is not very pleasant. And then, of course, this one, Super, who doesn't arrive very often. But it's every now and again when this was sort of going on for a while, and it was nothing more than a show. She would come along and say, "Come now, remember there is a plan. You're just messing around. Now there is a sort of plan to this thing." So she would just be somebody who came along and broke the scene basically, and kind of started a new one in a very simple way. So of course, what voices are trying to do is to kind of show you, give you the idea that there actually is a plan, that you're involved in it, whether you like it or not. Your thoughts are the deciding factor, one way or other, about the sort of fate of mankind or humankind. And that's just the way it is, whether you like it or not. Of course, none of this is very pleasant. And of course, the fact that I'm still here and rejecting all of this and telling God to fuck off and die, of course, is proof for me that there is no God. But of course, the other thing, or that these voices are not God, well, and that there is no God. Any God that allows this doesn't deserve, well, who knows what he deserves. But anyway, the key thing here again is to remember that voices are operating from this frame of reference, which is completely different than mine. Okay, and of course my brain is fully occupied operating from a different frame of reference. So the idea, you would have to say that my brain has two processes operating in parallel, where there's one that I'm in control of in the ordinary way and aware of and can interrogate in the way that everybody can and can learn to. The other one is happening completely independent of me. And using a frame of reference that is not mine, in fact, one that I utterly reject, and bringing in information, that is, I won't say not known to me. I mean, sometimes not known to me, but nonsensical to me. Okay, let's put it that way around. I mean, it's clearly coming from a place that is not me. Let's put it that way. It's just out of character for me. So that's another way to kind of to think about it. So, okay, that video was a bit longer than I hoped for, but I hope that gives you an idea of what people are dealing with in the relationships with voices, and also why, coming along and describing this thing as auditory hallucinations or as being caused by some sort of psychological theme that's changing what you expect, just doesn't cut the mustard. You can't compete with the experiential evidence of literally hundreds of thousands of transactions a day in this relationship where voices have established this position of power, where there's this strong sensory kind of imbalance in this two-way channel. Unless you're describing how that happens, your clinical or psychological hypothesis just doesn't hold water. You have to explain the how. Forget about the why, explain the how this is happening. All right, and that's it. So once again, I'm putting these videos on YouTube. If you can help me fund this in any way, I've now started a page on Patreon. It's a site where, it's a crowdfunding site where people kind of pay a little a month to support someone doing this work. It's Patreon, patreon.com/MadSense is my page. If you can help, that will be much appreciated. Thank you very much.